Welcome back, and a very special welcome to our next guest, a senior fellow of our Center for Security Policy, a retired United States Marine Corps colonel, and a successful businessman, foreign service officer, and think tank denizen in East Asia for decades. His name is Grant Newsham. He is one of our go to guys on matters involving the Far East, and we want to talk with him about a country he knows well, Japan, in the context of, well, the threats that it is facing from China, as are we, and what the Japanese might do about it. Colonel Newsom, it's good to have you back, sir. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
A lot to talk about in this space. We don't have a lot of time. Let me just ask you to sort of set the stage for us. Japan is clearly watching what China has been doing with growing apprehension. I know you've been following closely, among other things, China's insertion into the Solomon Islands as just an example of what they're doing to try to exert dominion over the Western Pacific, rather large. Talk about that as a problem, not just for the Japanese, but for us as well. But how it may be shaping some of the Japanese thinking about the challenges they're facing at the moment.
Well, the Japanese have been well aware of Chinese efforts to insinuate themselves throughout the Pacific. In fact, there isn't a Pacific island where you won't find a substantial Chinese presence. It's commercial and political mostly for now. But the Solomon Islands, where the Chinese just got that deal with the Solomon Islands government that basically allows the Chinese military free reign in the country, potentially. And that's probably what will happen. The Japanese have been aware of this for a long time, much more than the Americans have. Partly because the Japanese have had to deal with the Chinese for a couple thousand years, and partly because they're next door neighbors. But this Chinese expansion into the region, and plus the more immediate Chinese pressure on the Japanese southern islands, the Senkaku Islands, and the implicit threat to the entire Ryukyu Island chain that stretches from mainland Japan down almost to Taiwan. The Japanese have felt pressured by this for at least 10 years, little more than that. And before that, they were aware of the Chinese risk. They've been telling the Americans for years, this is what's coming. The Americans have ignored them. Now we've woken up pretty much. So Japan is really worried. And one big change that I notice is that Japan is finally doing some of the things that you have to do to actually defend yourself. And by that I mean by being willing to fight. And you're seeing it in the kind of training they are doing, and particularly doing it with the American Navy, American Air Force, the US Marines as well. So you're seeing a big psychological shift in how Japan is looking at its own defense. It's no more just sitting back and hoping nothing happens, but now and being aware of the threat but not doing much. Now they are aware of this and are willing to fight, I think. They still have to do a lot to expand their military and improve its capabilities, however.
These are the sorts of things that you have been counseling them to do for, well, decades, I think. So it must be tremendously heartening to you that at least there seems to be at the policy level both an awareness of what you've been warning about as well as a willingness to take these sorts of steps. I guess one of the questions that I would ask you, there's talk now about a sort of counter strike capability. And I'm not quite sure whether that's a term of art or a euphemism. Are the Japanese, among other things, Colonel Newsom, reconsidering their national position on nuclear deterrence as an element of the kind of capabilities that they must be putting in place to deal with the Chinese threat?
They're not saying that publicly, but I would bet a reasonable amount that secretly that they have got the plans and that if necessary they are ready to build nuclear weapons. As I say, it's something they don't talk about, but it's not quite a hidden secret, but it's something that's probably there. The Japanese are just as smart as anyone, and they understand the risks. They've always had concerns about American reliability. They shouldn't. Well, maybe they should these days, but they've always had those concerns. When the Japanese talk about counter-strike capability, and they've been talking about it for at least a decade that I remember, what they're thinking of is some sort of a magic weapon, like a cruise missile, and you punch the GPS coordinates into it, you hit launch, it goes and destroys the North Korean or the Chinese missile launch site. And it's unfortunately it's not particularly well thought out on the Japanese side. They don't have any idea what is required for this. It's not to say it's a bad idea. It's just that it needs a lot more thought than it tends to get when politicians say we need a counterstrike capability. But that's where the Americans should be helping them more, helping them to think a little more clearly about what's required, and working together to come up with a regional solution, with a reasonable solution, because there really isn't a capability on Japan's part to sort of reach out and cause some harm and cause some damage to people that are threatening it. And those two people, of course, are the North Koreans, but particularly the Chinese. So it does give you a sense of how much work there is to be done on the Japanese side, even though the psychological change, I think, has pretty much happened.
I guess what I infer from what you've said is the Chinese threat is causing the Japanese to rethink everything, and they have the option to have a nuclear part of that response. Whether they're going to talk about it or whether they're going to act on it is another question or two, but it's still in the mix, perhaps. And I guess the question that I would also ask of you, sir, is you know the Japanese very well, is another approach. And I just wonder, since we're seeing evidence of it elsewhere, might simply be, well, for want of a better term, a separate peace with the Chinese. Do you see any appetite on the part of the Japanese to simply say, look, uh, the United States is not going to be a reliable ally for us any longer. We don't want to uh, take on the kinds of burdens that are implied by what you've described here in terms of building up their own military capabilities, given where they're starting from. Maybe we just see what we can do to get terms from the Chinese and live with them, albeit in a an inferior status rather than as a cornerstone of the free world. Any chance that's in the offing there?
Not now. And I don't see it in the foreseeable future. One could conceive of circumstances where the Americans completely backed out and the Chinese threat was so overwhelming and terrifying that Japan did submit. But that is something that would really happen at the very end. The Japanese just not are psychologically suited to play second fiddle to the Chinese, much less to be under their domination and control. And that goes back uh, quite a few years, centuries, in fact. So then that's one of the difficulties the Japanese have in reaching any sort of deal with the Chinese and vice versa is that neither can see themselves as inferior to the other side, which is what a certain type of deal requires. But this is something that is almost visceral in the Japanese thinking, is this unwillingness to submit to Chinese domination and control. And there's historical reasons for that, but I don't see that happening, even though Japan has just as many Quislings as the United States does, particularly as business class, which would sell out the country for some money. But I think the Japanese probably would have a sort of a greater sense of resistance to the communist Chinese threat than the Americans do, oddly enough. That may have something to do with geography and history.
Well, a lot of hard experience, I think it's fair to say. Well, praise God if that's the case, and I hope it will be an inspiration to our team as well as other allies in the region to buck up in the face of what is a threat to all of us. Let's face it, from the Chinese Communist Party. Let me ask you about one other topic, if I may, because it bears on all of this. I don't know whether quisling is the right term for it or a separate piece for that matter, but what we have been working towards, as you know, for some time, and you've been thinking and writing about this for very, very many years, is the important role that India can play in the so called Indo Pacific theater. What do you make of what the Indians are now doing, not just with respect to the Russians over Ukraine and energy and the like? And we, of course, had the recent interaction between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi. But what do you make of where they're headed. Is there, in fact, going to be that important pillar to our collective defense posture in that part of the world, or are the Indians sort of cutting us loose?
I don't know. I do hope they're not cutting us loose, and I don't think they are. Uh, but I do see them sort of making decisions based on what they think are India's immediate interests when it comes to Russia, Ukraine. Not with China, though. The Indians and the Chinese have been at war since the 60s, and most smart Indians will tell you that. But you do see India doing things that are different than what the U.S. would want them to do. But you'll notice that India gets criticized for being slavishly pro-Russia, for selling out its friends, whereas China is doing like 100 times worse when it comes to invasion of Ukraine and just everything it does in the region to intimidate and threaten. And but China is just considered trying to thread the needle to be neutral on the Ukraine issue, and India gets savaged for it. But I think if India is handled with a deft hand, they'll stay on side and will be a useful pillar. I note that an Indian P-8 anti-submarine aircraft was down in Darwin, Northern Australia, just the other day.
It's an important sign. Colonel, we have to leave it at that, I'm afraid. We're hard out of time. Thank you for yours today. Thank you for the great service you've rendered to our country over many years, including now as a senior fellow of the Center for Security Policy, for which we're very grateful. Come back to us again soon with updates on all of this, if you would.